When polar bears evolved to live on the sea ice, they evolved to eat a seal, primarily ice-associated seal diet. Well, that diet's purely carnivorous, and it's really high in fats, higher than any other species, higher than any other ursid. And there's recent genomic studies coming out that show that physiologically, bears have probably changed genetically and physiologically specific to that very high fat diet. The polar bear is a species of bear that has evolved to live on the sea ice that floats over the top of the Arctic Ocean. And because that's where they've lived, they've adapted in a variety of ways to that environment. For example, people often ask me why polar bears have so much shorter claws than grizzly bears, and I describe that it's sort of like ice crampons. They're not digging so much with those claws, but they're using it to be able to be stable on the sea ice. They've obviously evolved to have white fur, so they can't be seen by their prey as well. They blend in with their Arctic environment, making it really difficult for us to find them out on the sea ice. They are good swimmers.
I think it's valuable to take a step back in time and look at the situation with polar bear populations and climate change at the time that polar bears were listed in 2008 under the Endangered Species Act, and then compare it to now. And so if you look back in 2008, there are 19 subpopulations of polar bears. At that time, there were 5 subpopulations that were believed to be in decline. 2 were increasing, 5 were stable, and there were 7 subpopulations that were deemed data deficient, meaning we really don't know what's going on in those subpopulations. If we fast forward to 2012, we have now 8 subpopulations that are known to be in decline. 2 are still increasing, and those subpopulations are in the region called the Canadian Archipelago, which is projected to be long-term refugia for polar bears. In Alaska, we have 2 subpopulations. There's the Southern Beaufort Sea subpopulation that we share with Canada, and there's the Chukchi Sea subpopulation that we share with Russia.
We compared the current condition of the animals in the Chukchi Sea with the Southern Beaufort Sea, and we found that the Southern Beaufort Sea bears are smaller, they're in poorer condition, and they have lower rates of cub survival. So that was a very, very interesting finding and has led to questions that is the focus of most of my current work, is just to understand, well, why is that? Why do you have 2 populations adjacent to each other that have both seen sea ice loss, but you don't see the same response? And there's some really important points from this. We haven't seen a response in the Chukchi Sea in terms of their declines in their body condition reproduction to date, but there is substantial continued sea ice loss there. So we've been really, really careful to say that, well, this is a really interesting finding that they have not yet had any changes in condition reproduction. We don't expect that there can be endless sea ice loss without some impact eventually. They have to have the ice to access ice seals, which is their primary prey.
The Southern Beaufort Sea subpopulation has been studied by USGS for almost 30 years now. In the Chukchi Sea, we have less of an understanding because research has really only been done on the population side of things in the Chukchi, most recently since 2008.
And there are some really clear differences between those 2 areas. The Chukchi Sea has the Bering Strait, which brings warm, very productive waters. It's also very shallow. Almost the entirety of the polar bear's range in the Chukchi Sea is over very shallow water. In the Southern Beaufort Sea, there's a very narrow area of continental shelf that's thought to be the most productive habitats. So in the Southern Beaufort Sea in the summertime, as the sea ice has retreated off the continental shelf, the bears are going to end up in ice that's over very deep water where we suspect there's fewer seals. In the Chukchi Sea, when the ice retreats, it still remains over some shallow waters where there's probably some seals still available to them. So those systems are very different. It's not just about whether they've lost the ice, but are there still seals available in the habitats they're using? And so we're looking into that further, but there's definitely some very clear differences in those 2 ecosystems that may be the reason that we're already seeing effects of sea ice loss in the Southern Beaufort Sea and haven't seen them quite yet in the Chukchi Sea.
The last 10 or 15 years, we've seen sea ice retract further and further away each summer from that continental shelf. And what that's doing is rendering that shelf habitat functionally absent because there's no sea ice to hunt seals over. That's changing the dynamic between polar bears and ring seals. Polar bears have less time to hunt ring seals each summer.
Unlike other bear species, only pregnant polar bears den purely for the purposes of producing cubs. When they're in the den, they're not eating anything. They're fasting that entire time. So they have a very different annual nutritional cycle during those years where they have to den and produce cubs. It means they have to put on enough body fat, have enough energy stores to enter a den, meet their own caloric needs, and also enough nutrients to produce a cub and also lactate for that cub after it's born in approximately January in the den.
Ultimately, that's being manifested in the long-term data that we have that indicates a trend of decreased body mass through time. Structurally, bears in the southern Beaufort are getting a little bit smaller, so their stature is getting smaller through time. And those are probably all effects of some degree of chronic nutritional stress.
The concept of nutrition in my work is relatively broad, so not just what they eat, but the impacts of what they eat. So for example, when we look at the body mass of females, a female that has come out of the den, and we look at that same female during a year that she has not denned, it can be up to 100-pound difference in her body mass. So she loses substantial body mass and body fat reserves when she has cubs. So the only way she's able to produce cubs is to have put on substantial body fat prior to entering the den. Because their diet is actually pretty narrow. They don't eat a lot of different things. It's really about how much they eat. And how much they eat relates directly to their reproduction and their survival. And how is that related to sea ice, since they need the sea ice to access their food?
The future for polar bears is still unwritten. There is a lot of concern in the polar bear community, and I think the general conservation community, about how unmitigated climate change is going to affect not just polar bears, but other wildlife species. And the Arctic is kind of that sentinel system.
The information we're gathering on the ecology of the population and how healthy the bears are is informative to making decisions about harvest levels. There's also oil and gas activity in both the Chukchi Sea and the Southern Beaufort Sea, so we get information on where the bears are, when and where they might interact with oil and gas activities or other human activities. Polar bear management is conducted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they are authorized to manage polar bears under those authorities, the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So much of the work that we do feeds into what they need to do to meet the specifications in those authorities for protecting polar bears.
In the eyes of polar bears, not all sea ice is created equally. Polar bears occur in an environment that very few people venture into. They travel across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers in the course of a year, and it's very difficult to actually observe polar bears directly in their environment. We can't just sit back at places on the North Slope and wait for polar bears to come to us. We have to go to the polar bears. So our work necessarily involves going into the polar bear world.
One of the primary activities we do with our spring capture work is deploy radio collars and other types of satellite tags. So this is a GPS radio collar. We pick a subset of the adult females that we capture each year, and we fit them with these GPS collars. We put these collars out for a year at a time, and you can see here we've got this little device here, this black device on the collar, and we program that to detach at about a 52-week period.
From our capture work, we're able to assess polar bear health through various body measurements, also the collection of tissue samples, including blood and fat. And also, we collect data on individuals and age structure. That's very important for models that predict population size and trend. Polar bears do like edges. However, they prefer relatively high concentration ice. They like to be very close to ice that might be very broken up, maybe quite a bit of open water. But they like to stay on this ice that is a relatively high concentration, up to 50% sea ice or greater, because it affords them stability, security. It's kind of a refuge habitat. And then they can venture into these other areas right on the edge of the ice where seal hunting might be most productive for them. The focus of my work is to see if we can discern what sea ice characters are important for polar bears, to see if we can map the preferred habitats, to understand how those habitats vary across the seasons, how they have varied across the years, because we have a long history of satellite imagery of sea ice, and also to take this retrospective study and look ahead to predict what directions preferred sea ice habitat of polar bears is going.
What are the likely responses in the future under changing conditions? And that's really kind of the core of our research program, trying to use the information that we've collected historically, that we're collecting in a contemporary setting, and apply it to what we're likely to see in future settings. You can see aggregations of up to 80 polar bears a day visiting the bone pile at Kaktovik.
You really are what you eat, and this is one of the classic examples of that.
Back of their foreleg has some of the longest hairs on the bear's body. You can imagine when they're walking through the snow. Their forelegs being so furry kind of acts like a big boot with a big fur ruff. It protects their body from the snow and the cold. Some of the hairs grow up to 15 centimeters long. Pretty big hairs. The hair is a great tissue for examining diet because it grows over the course of a pretty long time. For bears, it's about 5 to 6 months.
Hair actually provides a record of diet, whether that's for a bear, for wolf, or even for humans.
When the hair's grown, it locks in the isotope signature of whatever they're eating at the time. And then that is preserved in the hair for as long as that hair is on their body.
The different tissue sources actually allow us to create a isotopic clock or a timeline. So within a year, how do the diets of these bears vary? And does that correspond with bears that might be actually spending time closer to shore or bears that are spending almost all their time out on the open sea ice?
A lot of other tissues are more dynamic. The blood is constantly changing, it's constantly turning over. Even muscle and other tissues, liver, are turning over and changing, but the hair preserves the record of their diet.
Prior work had actually taken those hair samples and amalgamated those into kind of an individual number or an individual unit. But one of the things that we were able to do is to dissect that hair up into increments, and those increments then gave us a measure of diet variability over time. And what we initially had expected from the previous literature was there wasn't much variability in the polar bear diet, that it was all essentially using seals all the time.
There are 3 whaling communities along Alaska's North Slope, the villages of Barrow, Nuiqsut, and Kaktovik, and they're about evenly spaced across the North Slope. Whaling, fall whaling occurs in September. That's the period when sea ice is at its minimum extent. That's the period when we have a lot of bears on shore, and so those bone piles become focal attractors for the polar bears.
Nobody really sees these bears eat that much because they're out on the sea ice. They're in a pretty desolate place. To be able to observe them would be an extremely difficult task. You'd have to send people out there, try to follow around bears out on the sea ice in the middle of nowhere, really. So nobody really sees these bears eat. And that's one of the advantages of what we do, is it has the power to observe populations or at least get an understanding of their diet where it would otherwise be nearly impossible.
But what we were able to discover is that there are a group of bears that spend time closer to the shore and then on a very regular basis are using these whale bone piles as a secondary diet resource.
We know that when you eat something, the stable isotope signature of your diet is going to show up in your tissues. Even though we never directly observe the bears eating, we have a really, really good idea, at least in a general sense, of what they're eating because of the stable isotope signatures of their prey. The different things that the polar bears eat have different amounts of this heavy isotope of nitrogen in them. So seals, way up the food chain, have a lot of heavy isotopes of nitrogen. The bowhead whales that are on the shore, for example, are a lot lower down the food chain, and they have a lot less of the heavy nitrogen. If the bear is eating a lot of seal, we see the heavy nitrogen that gets incorporated into the hair and into the blood. And if the bear is eating a lot of bowhead whale, we see that there's a lot less of the heavy nitrogen that gets incorporated into those tissues.
You know, bears in general are very quick learners. They're very smart animals. And if there's a little stretch of time where they're having a hard time hunting seals and they're in the vicinity of a bone pile, I think they might just take a little detour and come and check it out to see if there's some food there that they can take advantage of.
And I think the biggest surprise then came when we asked ourselves, okay, they are spending a lot of time here, but what are they doing for the rest of the year? Are they just coming in to eat at the whale carcasses and then going back out onto the ice, which is where bears typically spend most of their time hunting for seals? Or are they doing something different? Are their behaviors starting to change a little bit? We found that the bears who had spent time near the whale carcasses and who had a definitive bowhead whale signature in their hair had spent all of their year near the coast. A lot of these bears were spending 90% of their time within 50 kilometers of the coast. And the bears that didn't have the bowhead whale signature in their hair were not doing this. They'd only spent about 40% of their time near the coast, and they had been ranging far and wide, hundreds of kilometers out on the sea ice. So they had changed their foraging strategy pretty significantly.
Once you start feeding at the bone pile, you tend to kind of stay in close proximity to the bone pile, because why would you leave? It's, you know, energy-rich food. You don't have to expend any energy to get it. It's really kind of a smart foraging strategy to just hunker down there and feed at the bone pile. And we see that on average bears spend probably about 9 days or so feeding at the bone pile during a feeding bout. But we've seen evidence of bears using the Kaktovik bone pile even into January, at a time when there's plenty of sea ice.
A lot of people have said that, you know, there's few things that will let 20 or 30 polar bears get together without a fight, but a bowhead whale carcass is one of them. It's pretty amazing when you see these pictures of sometimes up to 50 or 60 bears hanging around one of these carcasses, and everybody's pretty happy. A lot of the bears are doing the typical polar bear thing. They're going out onto the sea ice and hunting seals for pretty much the whole year. Probably about 75% roughly were eating ringed seal or bearded seal for 90% of their diet for the whole year around. And then in about a quarter of the bears that we analyzed, we picked up at least some signature of what's most likely bowhead whale. That is on the high end of estimates of bears who come to shore and feed on the bowhead whale. And that definitely seems to be a change from 20 or 30 years ago. We only looked at a really small slice of 2 or 3 years, and we weren't able to get data for any bears for multiple years. So expanding this, looking at bears over the course of 3, 4, 5 years, and then looking at the broader population through time, we'll see if it's a persistent trend. But with the way the trends in the sea ice are going, it seems like it's a pretty likely scenario for these animals.
This application of understanding the modern processes, where we have lots of information, GPS collars, fine scale analysis of hair, and then bones that represent the lifetime of these individuals, we can then go back to previously recovered samples that might be 50 to 100 years old that were harvested by the Inuit community in historical times, and examine the question of whether or not the bear's behaviors have changed over the longer term.
There's a lot of things that can happen once the bears start coming to the shore and hanging out near places where there's a lot of people, because all of these whale carcasses are near communities on the North Slope. Inevitably, there's places where they can get human food, there's landfills, there's trash cans that are left unprotected. So The more you have these bears coming closer to human communities, the more chances there are for human-bear interactions, and inevitably that's not always going to be good.
This bear swam basically 2 miles an hour for 9 days straight. She never really varied her rate of speed and just plugged north.
One of the things I'm hoping to measure is how much does it cost a bear to swim, and how does that compare to what it costs a bear to walk?
2008, we had a wake-up call because one of the bears that we equipped with a radio collar decided to go for a swim. The Beaufort Sea at that time, up to 400 miles north of the coast, was completely ice-free. The bear eventually followed the sea ice back to the Alaska coast, and we were able to recapture her on the shore and retrieve her collar. And from her collar, we were able to download all of the data. We had great accelerometer data.
An accelerometer, it's a small electronic device, and it basically measures changes in motion. They've started to incorporate them into smartphones and tablets. For those devices, it basically recognizes when you rotate it, that you've turned it and it'll flip the screen, those sorts of things.
And it was like, wow. We knew polar bears would go swimming. And in years past, they enter leads and swim between ice flows. Probably up until the mid-90s, when they had to swim from land to ice, the distance wasn't all that far. Maybe 100 miles, but not 400 miles. Still, 100 miles is a pretty long ways, too. So it really shed some light on the capabilities of these bears.
So there's been research done with wild animals using accelerometers that have shown that you can actually correlate measures of acceleration, body acceleration from the accelerometer with energy expenditure. To do that, again, it involves using captive animals to apply to wild animals.
In 1985, we began using collars that operated by ultra-high frequency radio waves. These radio waves are actually transmitted to polar orbiting satellites, so we don't have to go fly around in an aircraft to go and find our polar bears. But the polar bears themselves are telling us where they are because each collar is sending a signal to a polar orbiting satellite. That data is sent to a ground receiving station, and then it is sent to us. The data that we receive from these collars is not just location data, but also activity data, whether the bear is walking around or whether it's sitting.
The accelerometer data is essentially in a waveform. It's sort of like looking at an EKG in terms of what it looks like. For example, if a bear is walking, you get this repetitive pattern as the bear makes a football. So you get this waveform with each step that the bear is making, and you get these large spikes in acceleration with each footfall. You get this undulating pattern that the actual animal's making, and that's reflected in the orientation of the tag as she moves up and down with each step. And then over here, she stops briefly for about 5 seconds to take a drink of water. She puts her head down, which is what this large wave and orientation represents, is her putting her head down. She's drinking, and you get these lower magnitude waves in terms of what's called dynamic acceleration, which is the actual acceleration of the animal across those 3 axes. And then she continues walking again, and you get these undulating patterns. In terms of the dynamic acceleration, you get these large magnitude spikes with each footfall, essentially. Compare that with, say with the bear's resting, if it's just sitting, looking from side to side, then you get, fairly low magnitude acceleration. You can see it's considerably different compared to the walking signature. Instead of getting that undulating pattern, you really get this slow wave as she's moving her head from side to side.
This was likely a very taxing endeavor for this individual, because from the capture on the 26th of August to the capture on the 26th of October, that bear lost 21% of her body weight. Additionally, at her first capture, she had a yearling cub with her. The cub was 350 pounds. On the second capture, that cub was not with her. So someplace along the way, either during the swim or on the trek back across the pack ice, she lost that cub. This long trek was quite expensive for her. All told, she swam 425 miles over the 9-day period.
The accelerometer itself is collecting at extremely high frequencies. The tags we're using are recording 16 times a second. When you think about something recording 16 times a second over the course of an entire year, it's an extreme amount of data that we're hoping to collect. But because it's recording at such a high frequency, it's basically able to capture all those small changes in body motion that the animal is making.
The frequency of long-distance swimming has increased substantially by polar bears in the Beaufort Sea. The distances they have to cover, the frequency that it actually occurs, we're seeing it more often. Prior to 1996, however, sea ice generally did not melt away from the continental shelf. So polar bears could either remain over the continental shelf, or if they were on land, it was just a short distance. That has changed dramatically since 1996. Polar bears now, many of them, when they decide to go for a swim, it involves a considerable commitment in time and energy. And I don't think they make that decision when they're about to swim because they don't know how far away the sea ice actually is. They're just doing what they have evolved to do, and this is go for a swim. Now it's just a lot further and potentially energetically expensive for them.